January 14th, 1944. Dawn breaks over a remote Pacific atoll, waves lapping against black volcanic sand. The dense jungle shivers under the humid breeze, broken only by distant gunfire and the metallic clatter of Japanese sentries checking their weapons. From their hidden observation posts, Japanese troops strain their eyes through binoculars, scanning the shoreline. Smoke curls from freshly landed landing craft, and the rhythmic hammering of unseen machinery cuts through the morning air. Suddenly, figures emerge from the surf. U.S. Marines, drenched, carrying prefabricated metal matting, portable bulldozers, and heavy tools. In a coordinated rhythm, they begin leveling the uneven terrain, laying down a runway where yesterday only jungle existed. Japanese soldiers freeze, disbelief etched on their faces. How could an entire airfield rise in a single night? The roar of engines and clanging steel fills the island as Marines move with practiced precision, hauling supplies, driving pilings, and rolling out runways. Each movement calculated, each team synchronized. By nightfall, the skeletal outline of a functioning airfield stands ready for the first American aircraft. The enemy watches in stunned silence, realizing that the war here is about to shift under their very feet. The question remains, how did the Marines accomplish the impossible so swiftly? And what did it mean for the Pacific Campaign? By early 1944, the war in the Pacific had settled into a brutal rhythm of advance, resistance, and relentless adaptation. The initial shock of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor more than 2 years earlier had ignited the full industrial and military power of the United States. What began as a desperate defense had transformed into a calculated, methodical march across the Pacific Ocean, an enormous terrain of water and scattered land, dotted with islands that now carried unprecedented strategic value. Each island was no longer just a stretch of jungle or rock. It was an airfield waiting to be built, a harbor waiting to be seized, a stepping stone toward the Japanese home islands. The American strategy was simple in concept, but monumental in execution. It became known as island hopping. Rather than recapturing every Japanese-held position, U.S. forces would identify key islands, overwhelm them, and turn them into forward operating bases. From there, aircraft would fly farther than ever before, ships would refuel closer to enemy territory, and supply lines would stretch with precision across open ocean. For Japan, every island was sacred ground. Garrison forces were ordered to fortify beaches, construct underground bunkers, reinforce cliffs, and conceal artillery inside mountains. Their goal was not flexibility, it was endurance. Commanders were instructed to fight to the last breath, transforming islands into fortresses that bleeded every attacker that came ashore. Air power, however, changed everything. In modern war, control of the sky meant control of the battlefield. Without air superiority, no army could advance safely. Without airfields, no nation could sustain that superiority. The Japanese understood this. So did the Americans. But the United States saw airfields not only as targets to destroy. They saw them as assets to create, sometimes in places where no rational engineer would believe it possible. Before 1942, the construction of an airfield was a long, careful process. It required surveying, months of labor, the shipment of massive construction materials, stable terrain, and secure surroundings. On small islands of volcanic rock and dense jungle, the idea of building a functional runway in days, or even hours, bordered on fantasy. But during the Second World War, the United States began to bend reality through logistics, planning, and ruthless efficiency. Across the American mainland, factories had transformed into engines of war. Steel rolled in unprecedented quantities. Machinery was designed with speed and function in mind. Airplanes left production lines in numbers the world had never witnessed. But equally important, though far less glorified, was the creation of specialized construction units prepared to follow directly behind the first wave of assault troops. They were sailors, engineers, mechanics, welders, carpenters, machine operators. Officially, They were known as naval construction battalions. To everyone else, they became something much simpler: the Seabees. Their role was unique in modern military history. They were trained not only to build under the most extreme conditions imaginable, but to do so while under fire. They carried rifles and bulldozers with the same familiarity. They arrived on shores not with dreams of glory, but with blueprints already memorized in their minds. As Marines secured beachfronts through blood and fire, these construction battalions moved inland almost immediately, marking terrain, pushing aside debris, leveling terrain, and preparing for the most important transformation an island could undergo: turning raw earth into a launch point for American air power. This ability created a new type of warfare, one in which victory did not simply come from destroying the enemy's strongholds, but from replacing them with something far more powerful: an American runway. For Japanese forces watching from concealed positions, this transformation was deeply unsettling. Islands that were meant to be defensive sanctuaries began to change shape before their eyes. What had once been natural protection started to resemble American infrastructure. What was once wilderness slowly turned into unmistakable order. From their perspective, it was not simply military engineering. It was an invasion of reality itself. And yet, this moment in January 1944 was still only the beginning. Behind the landing forces on the beach lay a deeper system, an intricate network of planning, logistics, invention, and human coordination unlike anything the world had seen before. To understand how an airfield could be raised in a single night, one must look behind the front lines, into the extraordinary machinery that made such speed possible. Shall I continue to Section 2 of Context, focusing on the Seabees, logistics, equipment, and rapid construction methods that made this moment possible? Behind every American landing in the Pacific was not only a battle plan, but a construction plan. Long before the first landing craft touched hostile shores, planners inside steel-walled rooms in Hawaii, San Diego, and Washington had already begun calculating soil composition, rainfall patterns, coastline gradients, and the precise number of bulldozers required to transform chaos into infrastructure. This was not improvised engineering. It was scientific, deliberate, and relentlessly rehearsed. The men responsible were drawn from civilian life: construction workers, steel workers, electricians, plumbers, highway crews, architects, engineers, dock workers, and heavy equipment operators. They were given naval uniforms, military ranks, rapid weapons training, and an impossible skill set: the ability to build an entire functioning base while under the constant threat of snipers, artillery, and air attack. The name Seabees came from their initials, CB, Construction Battalion. But in practice, they were something unprecedented in military history: an army of builders who moved as fast as assault troops. To make overnight airfields possible, the United States developed portable, modular construction technologies specifically for the Pacific. One of the most significant innovations was pierced steel planking, known as Marston matting. Thin but incredibly strong steel sheets, perforated with holes to reduce weight, could be locked together in minutes to form a stable runway surface for fighters, bombers, and transport planes. These sheets could be stacked inside landing ships, unloaded under fire, and carried by hand through sand, mud, and shattered vegetation. Once on the ground, teams of men would align and interlock them in long, straight lines, creating a usable runway where, only hours earlier, trees had stood. Bulldozers and graders landed beside them. Modified for tropical conditions, these machines were sealed against dust and heat. They carved flat ground through jungle roots and volcanic rock, often working around unexploded shells and cratered terrain. Fuel dumps, ammunition depots, command tents, medical stations, and communications towers followed closely behind. Every piece was standardized. Every layout had been practiced. No detail was left to chance. The speed came not from chaos, but from preparation. While Japanese engineers relied heavily on manual labor and slow transport, the American approach emphasized mobility. Cranes were mounted onto ships. Trucks were disassembled and reassembled on shore. Portable power generators could be unpacked and activated within minutes. Entire workshops unfolded from metal containers. Behind this logistical miracle stood the untouched industrial power of the United States mainland. Factories ran day and night, producing spare parts in such numbers that loss was expected, not feared. If a bulldozer was destroyed, another was already being loaded thousands of miles away. This created a psychological effect on the battlefield almost as important as any bomb or bullet. For Japanese troops observing the process from their hidden positions, there was no frame of reference for what they were witnessing. Their doctrine had taught them that war moved slowly, that nature was an ally, and that difficult terrain meant protection. But in front of them, nature was being stripped away, reshaped, and commanded by men who had arrived from across the world. In less than a day, an island that once provided cover had become a platform for the very aircraft that would soon dominate their skies. This was the true innovation, not just weapons, but speed of transformation. And as the last steel sheets locked into place and the final engine was tested, the island did not just belong to its original soil and trees anymore. It now belonged to American design, American planning, and American reach. But the story of this transformation is not just about machines or logistics. It is also about the men who carried, cut, leveled, and built, and the invisible shockwaves this created inside the enemy's mind. From here, the same moment can be seen through different lenses. The human strain, the tactical implications, the technological story, the enemy's perspective. These angles would define not only this island, but the future of the Pacific War. From a distance, the construction of an airfield may have appeared mechanical, a cold sequence of earth moving, steel fitting, and engine noise. But on the ground, it was defined by human strain. The men who stepped onto that shattered island were not immune to exhaustion, fear, or doubt. Many had already taken part in previous landings across the Pacific. They had survived beaches turned red by gunfire, nights filled with the stutter of machine guns, and jungles that swallowed men without warning. Now, with rifles slung across their backs, they moved forward carrying steel plates instead of weapons, their uniforms soaked through with sweat and salt water. There was no pause, no ceremony, no moment to appreciate the scale of what they were trying to do. A bulldozer lurched forward over tangled roots. An operator guided it through smoke as Marines formed a perimeter just meters away. Behind them, men slammed metal into place with heavy mallets, the sharp clanking echoing across the sand. Others leveled the ground with precise measurements learned in rushed training months before. Every man had a role, and each role was essential. In that fragile time between capture and counterattack, speed meant survival. The quicker the airfield was completed, the sooner American planes could land. The sooner planes could land, the faster wounded men could be evacuated, supplies could arrive, and enemy positions could be struck from above. Without a runway, the island was just a battlefield. With a runway, it became a weapon. Tactically, this represented a devastating shift in control. Japanese commanders had constructed their defenses to repel naval and ground assault. Their artillery was positioned toward beaches. Their bunkers were aimed at predictable entry points. Their anti-aircraft guns were limited and scattered. What they had not anticipated was that the shore itself would be converted into an American platform. The moment aircraft could land and take off from that island, the entire geometry of the battlefield changed. American planes no longer had to rely on distant carriers or faraway bases. They could strike repeatedly, rapidly, and close to the front lines. This overwhelmed Japanese defensive planning. Supply ships, which once could slip through the Pacific under cover of distance, now traveled under constant threat. Troop movement by sea became increasingly dangerous. Communication lines between islands were broken by relentless air patrols. What had once looked like a string of strongholds began to resemble isolated outposts, slowly cut off from oxygen. This was not brute force alone. It was spatial control. From a technological perspective, the airfield was a showcase of American problem-solving under extreme conditions. Engineers disguised improvisation as precision. They learned how to compact sand using layers of crushed coral. They discovered ways to drain water in terrain that had never known order. Tools were re-engineered for speed. Vehicles were adapted on the spot. Mistakes were absorbed into the process and corrected in real time. Innovation happened with muddy hands and no lab. The tools of modern war were not always glamorous. There were no shining laboratories on that beach, only men kneeling in dirt, shouting measurements through engine noise, aligning steel by hand, and adjusting under pressure. Above all, there was discipline. The men working those lines did not see themselves as part of a cinematic moment. To them, it was simply another assignment. But their quiet efficiency stood in direct contrast to the rigid, often inflexible Japanese doctrine, where one side believed in static defense and honor-bound last stands, the other thrived on adaptation, replacement, and mobility. This difference created more than tactical advantage. It created psychological imbalance. For the Japanese soldiers watching from under leaves and broken stone, the sight was disturbing on a fundamental level. They had been taught that nature was an ally, that the island itself would protect them. They had trained to blend into it. They had built their positions to become part of it. And yet here were men who erased it. Trees fell, ground leveled, hills reshaped. What had once been cover was reduced to material. The island was no longer familiar, even to those who had memorized its shape. It was becoming American. The reaction was not only fear. It was disbelief, a slow, quiet realization that their understanding of warfare had fallen behind the present moment. They were fighting with ideas from the past against tools of the future. And still, within this transformation, there remained one critical unknown. The airfield had been built, the ground prepared, the lines cleared, but its true test had not yet arrived, because now, the sky itself would soon answer the question of whether this overnight miracle would become an unbreakable advantage or a target for annihilation. That answer would arrive in the form of engines in the distance, black silhouettes against a rising sun, and the first American aircraft descending toward the newly born runway. Behind every rapid transformation on the battlefield was leadership measured not in speeches, but in foresight. American commanders in the Pacific had come to understand something fundamental. Speed was mercy, not only for their men, but for the war itself. Admirals such as Chester W. Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur recognized that every week saved on an island was a week cut from the entire campaign. Every airstrip completed was another link in a chain slowly closing around the Japanese mainland. So, authority in this theater took on a different shape. Instead of focusing solely on conquering land, American leadership focused on constructing reach. Orders were built around efficiency rather than conquest for its own sake. Landings were timed not just to tides and weather, but to engineering schedules. Plans were coordinated months in advance. Seabees were briefed before Marines ever saw the shoreline. Equipment was color-coded, packed in precise sequences, and assigned to specific landing waves. There was no space for improvisation at the top, which is exactly what allowed improvisation at the bottom to succeed. This mindset stood in sharp contrast to Japanese leadership philosophy. Japanese commanders were shaped by deeply traditional military culture, one that prized immovable defense and honor over adaptation. Retreat was considered shameful. Yielding ground was seen as betrayal. Flexibility was often interpreted as weakness. Thus, when American forces did not behave as predicted, when they moved inland faster than expected, when they began to build instead of simply hold, Japanese officers struggled to respond. Their training had never prepared them for an enemy that turned conquered ground into operating power within hours. In observation bunkers, Japanese officers tried to encode what they were seeing into meaningful terms. How could an army build, supply, and defend all at once? Where were the delays? Where were the vulnerable moments? But there were none. Where Japanese doctrine relied heavily on centralized command, the American system encouraged decentralized execution. Junior officers and non-commissioned leaders had authority to make immediate decisions. If a clearing was unsuitable for a runway, it was shifted. If ground was too soft, coral was crushed and mixed in. If one motor failed, another was brought forward without waiting for permission. This fluid system created an impression of seamless activity, something almost predetermined. From the outside, it no longer even looked like chance. It looked inevitable. For the common Japanese soldier, the impact was profound and silent. They had grown accustomed to difficult conditions, scarcity, and rigid discipline. They had trained to rely on the landscape. They had suffered hunger, exhaustion, and isolation as a matter of expectation. Now, hidden in foliage, they watched men who seemed unhindered by terrain. U.S. troops drank from cold containers, ate packaged rations without cooking fires, received medical supplies by the crate. Machinery arrived already functional. Radios transmitted signals through static-filled air. Injured men were evacuated almost as soon as they fell. This efficiency produced a psychological wound deeper than any direct assault. It introduced a sense of hopeless scale. The enemy was not simply stronger, it was endless. In military psychology, perception often becomes reality. Once a force begins to believe the opposing side cannot be stopped, every decision becomes heavier, slower, uncertain. 4 Japanese units already stretched thin across vast distances. The knowledge that America could create bases from nothing broke confidence and undermined morale. They were no longer defending an island. They were watching the enemy's world being built around them. In many cases, Japanese soldiers chose to engage in isolated attacks against the runway at night, hoping to sabotage its completion. These efforts were brave, but often futile. Even when damage was done, repair crews worked through darkness. Temporary fixes were replaced by permanent sections at sunrise. Destruction could not outpace construction. This pattern repeated itself across the Pacific: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian, Iwo Jima. Each new airfield brought the United States closer and Japan further into isolation. But on this island, at this specific moment, the transformation was still fresh. The first landing strip stood like a scar against the natural world and prepared to receive what it was built for. Now came the moment that would determine everything. The moment the first American aircraft attempted to land. If it failed, the miracle would be remembered as a mistake. If it succeeded, it would become doctrine. Engines began to hum beyond the horizon. Shapes appeared in the morning sky. Men on the ground paused and looked upward, shielding their eyes from the sun. Japanese observers held their breath in hidden silence. Steel, oil, manpower, doctrine, and belief had all converged. Now they awaited the answer from the air itself. And with that approaching sound, history approached its turning point. Shall I now begin the climax/turning point? Section 1, 750, 900 words, describing the first landings, battlefield reactions, and the decisive transformation of air power? By 1944, the Pacific Ocean had become a vast battlefield. What once appeared to be an endless blue expanse of calm now served as a highway of warships, submarines, and aircraft carriers moving silently through the night. The conflict between the United States and the Empire of Japan had transformed tiny, forgotten islands into military prizes, each one a stepping stone toward dominance in the Pacific. The Japanese strategy was simple but effective: control the islands, control the air, control the sea. Every atoll, every strip of volcanic land became a fortified position. Bunkers were dug into hillsides, anti-aircraft guns perched along coastlines, and hidden artillery waited beneath thick camouflage. From these island fortresses, Japanese forces could monitor sea routes, launch air attacks, and disrupt American movements. For the Americans, these islands were more than mere pieces of land. They were keys. Keys to reaching the Philippines, keys to pushing toward Japan itself, and ultimately, keys to ending the war. This strategy became known as island hopping, a methodical campaign in which American forces would bypass heavily fortified islands and instead seize strategically valuable ones, using them as bases for airfields and naval stations. From these new positions, American bombers and fighters could strike deeper into enemy-held territory. Every new runway meant firepower could reach farther. Every new base meant supply lines grew stronger. But building these bases was never easy. The islands were hostile in every sense of the word. The ground was often rock-solid coral that shattered tools and broke machinery. The climate was oppressive. Temperatures soared, rain poured without warning, and clouds of insects made even the simplest task unbearable. And all of this occurred under the constant threat of enemy fire. Every movement, every hammer strike, every engine start could draw attention from hidden snipers or artillery batteries. Yet speed was everything. A completed airfield could mean the difference between victory and defeat. If the Americans controlled the air, they controlled the battle. Without a runway, aircraft had to rely on carriers, vulnerable giants floating in open sea. With a runway, fighters could launch within minutes, bombers could refuel quickly, and reconnaissance planes could scan hundreds of miles of ocean. The U.S. military knew this. They understood that in modern warfare, engineering was just as important as bullets. This responsibility fell to a unique and often overlooked group of men, the engineers and construction battalions, known as the Seabees. These are not ordinary builders. Most had been construction workers, mechanics, carpenters, and machine operators in civilian life before joining the military. Now, they were trained soldiers as well, capable of both building and fighting. Their mission was almost impossible: land on enemy territory and create a fully functional airfield in days, sometimes in mere hours. To achieve this, the Americans developed revolutionary methods. Instead of relying only on concrete, they used prefabricated metal sheets, interlocking panels that could be rolled out over uneven ground to form instant runways. Heavy bulldozers and graders were modified to work in extreme conditions. Supplies were meticulously organized, every crate numbered, every tool assigned a precise role. Nothing was left to chance. Before landing on any island, U.S. intelligence analyzed aerial photos, studied the terrain, calculated soil density, and predicted how long construction would take. Specialized teams were assigned specific tasks. One team cleared debris, another leveled the ground, another laid down the metal matting, and another installed fuel lines and communications equipment. It was a mechanical symphony of war and construction. Meanwhile, Japanese troops on neighboring islands or hidden in the jungle watched in disbelief. Their defensive planning had never considered a project of such speed and scale. In their minds, the construction of an airfield was an operation that would take months, not a single night or a matter of days. This shock, this failure to comprehend the Americans' technological and logistical efficiency, became a major turning point in the war. Because once the first American aircraft landed on that newly carved strip of metal and earth, the balance of air power shifted dramatically. Now the Americans could strike deeper, faster, and with greater frequency. What had been a defensive war for Japan began to feel like an unstoppable tidal wave, pushing ever closer to their homeland. And that brings us back to that particular morning in January 1944, the moment an empty island began to transform in front of stunned enemy eyes. What happened next was not only a feat of engineering, but one of the most important psychological victories of the Pacific Campaign. In the next section, we will follow the step-by-step construction of the airfield itself, from the first Marine landing on the beach to the moment the first aircraft touched down on a runway that had not existed just hours before. The first waves did not arrive with rifles raised high. They arrived with bulldozers, steel matting, axes, ropes, survey tools, and radios. As the landing craft scraped against the black volcanic sand, ramps slammed down into the surf. Men poured out, waist-deep in water, struggling forward under the weight of machinery and gear. Engines coughed, then roared to life as dozers were dragged onto land by chains and cables. The ground beneath their boots was uneven, jagged rock, tangled roots, mud disguised beneath a thin crust of coral. Above them, the early morning sky was still pale and uncertain. Somewhere in the distance, Japanese artillery thundered. A shell tore into the jungle behind the beach, sending branches and dirt into the air like a violent storm. But the men did not stop. They had a schedule to keep. Minute 1, claim the ground. The very first objective was not to build. It was to claim. Marine infantry pushed ahead into the dense foliage, securing a perimeter. Gunfire cracked in short, violent bursts. Smoke filled the air, mixing with the salty ocean breeze. Every bush, every shadow could hide a man with a rifle. Only when the immediate threats were neutralized did the construction teams move forward. Behind them, the engineers stepped onto the newly secured land. This is where the real race against time began. Hour 1, clear the jungle. Axes swung into tree trunks. Chainsaws screeched as they cut through thick wood. Bulldozers shoved massive roots from the earth, dragging entire sections of jungle into piles. The green world that had taken decades to grow was torn open in minutes. Dust rose in thick clouds, coating skin and uniforms. Sweat poured down backs. The air was hot, wet, and suffocating. Still, the machines kept moving. Every yard cleared from the jungle was one step closer to a functioning airfield. Hour 3, level the earth. The ground itself was the enemy now. Island soil was rarely soft. In many places, it was nothing more than sharp coral rock, the leftovers of ancient underwater reefs raised above sea level. Blades of the bulldozers scraped over it, sparking as metal struck stone. Grading machines followed close behind, smoothing the torn earth into something resembling a runway. Every bump could be fatal for an aircraft trying to land at high speed. Every slope had to be corrected. Every dip had to be filled. Teams worked by instinct and precision. No delays, no mistakes. If a machine broke down, another immediately took its place. There was no such thing as stopping. Hour 5, the matting arrives. Then came the miracle material, metal runway matting. Long steel or aluminum panels, perforated, ridged, and interlocking, were carried from landing craft and trucked to the construction zone. These sheets, often referred to as Marston mats, were carefully designed to lock together like pieces of a giant puzzle. Dozens of men dropped to their knees in the dirt, locking edges together with practiced speed. Bang, bang, click, slide, lock, again and again. In only minutes, stretches of gleaming metal began to cover the ravaged earth. What had been jungle at sunrise was starting to resemble an airstrip. Hour 7, enemy fire. The enemy finally understood what was happening. Japanese artillery opened once again. Explosions tore through the far end of the clearing. Shrapnel screamed through the air. A truck burst into flames. A bulldozer tipped onto its side, smoke pouring from its engine. But the strangest thing happened. No one ran. They stepped around the wreckage. They replaced fallen men. They dragged the next panel into place. The work continued, even as the earth itself seemed to shake in protest. The sound of hammers did not stop. Hour 10, fuel, comms, and supply. While one group focused on the runway, other specialized units worked on fuel storage, communications, and logistics. Fuel lines were buried shallow in the ground. Temporary tanks were set up a safe distance away. Radios were assembled and tested. Signal flags and beacons were positioned at each end of the runway. Every component had been rehearsed back in the United States, down to the minute. This wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Hour 14, the first test. Late in the afternoon, as the sun dipped lower and turned the sky orange-red, an officer walked the length of the runway. He studied the surface, the joins between the panels, the firmness of the ground below. He nodded once. Out at sea, a small aircraft received the signal. Its engine cut through the sky like a blade. The plane circled the island once, then twice, then slowly descended. Marines shielded their eyes as the aircraft came in low, almost brushing the treetops. For a moment, it seemed impossible, and then the wheels touched metal. The aircraft skidded slightly, then stabilized. It rolled forward, picking up confidence, speed, control, until it finally came to a stop near the center of the strip. A silence fell over the island. Then cheers erupted. Men fell to their knees in the dirt, laughing. Others simply stared in disbelief. A runway, a real, functioning runway, had risen from nothing in less than a day. From chaos, order had been created. From jungle, a weapon had been forged. The power of that moment. But this was more than construction. This was a message to the enemy. We can build faster than you can destroy. A message to the world. The rules of war have changed. And a message to history. Logistics can win battles. When the first squadrons of fighters and bombers began landing and taking off from that strip in the days that followed, the island stopped being just a piece of land. It became a launch pad for the fall of an empire. And for the Japanese soldiers watching from distant hills and bunkers, it was as if the earth itself had turned against them, giving birth to an American airbase right before their eyes. In the next section, we will explore the immediate impact of this airfield, the missions launched from it, the destruction it brought, and why historians still consider it one of the most underestimated turning points of the Pacific War. The metal on the runway did not cool before the war found it. Within hours of that first test landing, new aircraft arrived, not in ceremony, but in waves. Fighters, dive bombers, transport planes. Their silhouettes cut across the sky like dark birds of steel, one after another, each one rolling to a stop on the still warm matting. The engineers stepped aside and watched their creation come alive. For the first time, enemy territory now held a fully functioning American airbase. And with that, everything changed. The first combat sorties. The earliest missions were not grand offensives. They were tests of reach and speed, reconnaissance flights, interdiction patrols, and defensive screens to protect the island from counterattack. American pilots lifted off just minutes after landing, often without even shutting down their engines completely. They were briefed on the move. Intelligence was relayed through hand signals, scribbled maps, and shouted instructions over roaring motors. These missions had a single, precise objective: find the enemy before they reached the beach. And they did. Japanese troop movements that had once been hidden beneath jungle canopy or mountain shadow were suddenly visible from above. Supply routes previously thought secure were now exposed. Artillery positions, fuel dumps, and concealed bunkers were photographed, mapped, and quietly marked for destruction. The sky had become American. Precision from power. The real impact became evident in the days that followed. Bombers began departing from the newly constructed strip under cover of dawn. Their engines roared so loud that birds abandoned the trees and scattered from the island's edges. Each aircraft carried a carefully calculated payload, bombs calibrated for specific targets based on the new aerial intelligence. Rail lines vanished in fire and smoke. Bridges folded into rivers. Hidden craters blossomed into permanent scars on the landscape. But this was not blind destruction. It was systematic dismantling. Every mission was planned with one principle in mind: remove the enemy's ability to move, supply, communicate, or reinforce. The airfield was no longer just a runway. It was a control switch, turning entire regions of enemy territory on and off at will. The enemy reaction. From a distance, Japanese commanders observed an impossible sight. Where there had once been nothing, no structures, no towers, no hangars, they now saw constant aircraft activity. They could see the gleam of metal strips in the sun. They counted takeoffs. They tracked landings. It defied reason. In their planning, construction of that scale required months. Huge factories, massive infrastructure, a long buildup. America had done it in days, and that realization cut deeper than any bomb ever could. Reports from surviving Japanese units described the same response. Disbelief, then fear, then a desperate attempt to adapt. New orders were issued. Target the runway first. More artillery was aimed at that strip than any other object on the island. But the U.S. had already calculated for that. The repair crews. Each time the runway was struck, another group moved in, not to retreat, but to repair. Spare matting lay stacked at the edges of the field. Pre-cut panels waited for quick replacement. Teams moved like surgeons over open wounds of metal and earth, lifting damaged sections, sliding in new ones, and securing them in place before the smoke had even cleared. In less than an hour, what had been ripped open by explosives became operational again. Japanese soldiers watched through binoculars as their successful strikes seemed to evaporate into nothing. A direct hit became a minor inconvenience. That realization had a psychological effect that radiated through the chain of command. How do you defeat an enemy whose strength regenerates faster than your ability to destroy it? Air superiority established. Within a week, American fighters controlled the surrounding sky entirely. Enemy aircraft attempting to approach were intercepted long before they reached striking distance. Dogfights erupted, brief and brutal. Most ended the same way, American pilots returning safely while wreckage burned far below. The newly built field became an extension of American carriers at sea, a stationary, unsinkable platform that could launch and receive aircraft 24 hours a day. Night runs, morning runs, emergency landings under fire. All possible now. The U.S. did not need to wait for the enemy's move. They dictated it, a new kind of warfare. This was something the world had never truly seen before. Wars had always advanced by lines on maps, by boots on the ground, pushing slowly forward. But this was a different curse. America was no longer advancing by meters. It was advancing by minutes and miles, through air, steel, and speed. Each new airfield turned another section of the Pacific into reachable territory. Each island became a stepping stone not just for troops, but for dominance of an entire region. To Japanese forces, this phenomenon had a terrifying clarity. Even islands thought to be safe, remote, distant, isolated, were now only one airstrip away from becoming targets. The Pacific began shrinking, not by geography, but by American capability. The human witnesses, among the Marines and Seabees, the realization came quietly, often while standing at the edge of the runway, watching another loaded aircraft disappear over the horizon. They had existed in mud and chaos just days earlier. Now, they stood at the center of a machine larger than any individual, a system so powerful, so precise, that a single moment of construction had shifted the future of the war. Some slept beside their machines. Others lay on the hard metal panels they had installed themselves. The ground vibrated beneath them as planes took off through the night. But none complained, because they understood. This strip of metal was saving lives further down the line on another island in another battle. And as more missions lifted from its surface, as more American silhouettes streaked toward enemy positions, one truth became unavoidable. This was not just engineering. It was domination through design, and it would only intensify, which leads to the moment the enemy would never forget, the moment when the full weight of what America had built on that island finally turned outward. The transformation did not happen all at once. Like a rising storm, it built in quiet layers, pressure accumulating in unseen spaces until the atmosphere itself felt different. For days, the new airfield functioned like a living artery. Aircraft arrived and departed with increasing frequency. Radio towers pulsed with coded transmissions. Crates of ammunition were stacked and res-tacked. Fuel drums rolled into position. Maps were updated by the hour. And above everything else, one constant remained: the rhythm of engines. To the men on the ground, that sound became the new heartbeat of the island. To the enemy, it became a warning, one that grew louder with each passing hour. A shift in command awareness. Japanese command units, positioned miles away in hardened bunkers and fortified hillsides, began receiving reports that no officer wanted to read. American aircraft numbers were increasing. Departure times were shortening. Mission ranges were extending. And most disturbing of all, the attacks were becoming coordinated from a single fixed point on land that should not yet exist. At first, the reports were dismissed, then questioned, then verified. When aerial photographs confirmed the truth, silence filled the command rooms. There it was, a bright skeletal runway carved directly into what satellite intelligence had always marked as impenetrable jungle. Support vehicles moving in precise patterns. Aircraft aligned in neat formation. anti-air defenses even placed along its perimeter. It was not temporary. It was permanent, and it was expanding. The realization landed like physical weight. This was no longer about holding an island. This was about surviving an entirely new phase of the war. The strategic implication. Every military campaign relies on reach. Distance defines what can be attacked, defended, supported, or abandoned. For years, the vastness of the Pacific had protected many Japanese-held positions. Even if American ships could approach, they often could not stay long enough or close enough to maintain full pressure. But the construction of that runway erased distance. Suddenly, American fighters could patrol areas once thought unreachable. Bombers could strike deeper, faster, and return safely within hours. Damaged aircraft could land, refuel, rearm, and take off again, all on hostile territory that now functioned like an extension of the United States. It changed the map overnight. Entire Japanese garrisons found themselves inside newly formed kill corridors, zones from which there was no real defense. Supplies that had once moved by sea were intercepted by aircraft. Reinforcements that attempted to arrive were destroyed before they reached shore. The airfield turned the surrounding ocean and land into controlled space. And control meant inevitability. The mission that marked the shift. Then came the operation that confirmed the turning point. In the early hours before dawn, a special strike package assembled along the runway. These were not routine patrols. These were targeted, high-priority aircraft prepared for a mission of psychological and strategic value. Pilots gathered in small groups near improvised briefing boards. Officers pointed to maps where red markings had appeared, supply depots, communication hubs, staging areas used by higher-ranking Japanese elements. This time, the objective was not simply damage. It was demonstration, a message to be delivered in fire and precision. As engines ignited one by one, the ground shuddered with energy. Orange flames pulsed at the exhausts. The scent of burned fuel filled the humid air. Men removed their caps without realizing it, watching steel bodies begin their slow roll across the metal surface. The first plane lifted, then the second, then the third, a continuous chain of power climbing into the sky. Within minutes, the island appeared quiet again. But the calm was deceptive. What had just launched from that runway represented one of the most devastating concentrations of organized force in the region. Above the sea, the aircraft formed up into perfect formation, a dark, mechanical constellation moving directly toward key enemy positions. Those positions never saw it coming. A sudden shock from the sky. To the Japanese soldiers on the ground, the attack felt less like a battle and more like the sky collapsing. There were no warning sirens, no extended buildup, only the sudden howl of diving aircraft, followed by explosions that shook the earth down to its roots. Command posts vanished into firestorms. Antennas snapped. Vehicles burned where they stood. Communication lines went dead one after another until entire sectors were left blind and mute. Men ran from bunkers only to find there was nowhere to hide. The American pilots had been trained to strike with purpose and precision. Their bombs were not scattered. They were placed, each one as deliberate as a hand closing around a throat. Within a short window of time, what had taken months to establish for the enemy was reduced to fractured ruins, all launched from a stretch of metal that had not existed a week earlier. Psychological impact. But the destruction was only one layer. The true turning point was psychological. For years, the narrative inside the Japanese military had emphasized endurance, loyalty, and the advantage of terrain. Islands and distance were considered natural defenses. The environment itself was seen as an ally. That belief broke the moment the airfield became operational. If the Americans could build a base here, then nowhere was unreachable, and nothing was permanent. The belief in natural protection collapsed. Morale did not fall suddenly, but fractured. Through every surviving unit, the same thought began spreading like infection. We are not fighting a distant enemy. We are fighting one who can simply appear. And that realization was devastating. It haunted every decision thereafter. The view from the runway. Back on the island, the men who had built the airfield watched returning aircraft with quiet recognition. Some planes limped back, scarred by fire. Others returned heavy with silence, their missions completed exactly as planned. When the first wheels touched metal again, a different kind of tension filled the air. Not fear, understanding. They understood now that they had not just built a landing strip. They had built a point in history, one that forward momentum could no longer escape. In the distance, smoke clouds darkened the horizon. The evidence of their work rose into the sky for anyone to see. The island, once nameless and forgotten, had become an axis on which power turned. And this was only the beginning, because what followed was even more consequential, a realization by Japanese leadership that the situation had shifted beyond recovery, and a response that would define the rest of the campaign. And that response is where the war on this island truly reached its breaking point. The last strike group is still in the air as their formation begins to curve back toward the metal strip. The second wave did not announce itself. There was no gradual buildup this time, no warning tremor, only a tightening in the air, like the world itself preparing to hold its breath. Over the horizon, silhouettes returned, darker now, sharper, closer. The strike group reappeared one by one, sliding out of the haze like phantoms bound to steel and fuel. To the men waiting below, they looked different than when they had departed. Their exteriors were dusted with smoke and speckled with holes. Some trailed thin scars of vapor from damaged lines. Others bore the visible black stains of close-range explosions. But they were still flying, and that, in itself, was a message. One after another, the aircraft lined up with the runway, descending carefully toward the narrow strip that had become the most critical piece of ground in the entire region. Wheels touched metal, not gently, but with purpose. Each landing was a confirmation of dominance. Each halt a quiet declaration. We control this place now. Mechanics sprinted from cover the moment the plane stopped. Ladders pressed against sides. Hands reached for fuel hoses, ammunition straps, replacement belts, repair kits. There was no ceremony, no applause, only speed and efficiency. This runway had one job: keep the sky filled with American wings. The Japanese counterstroke. Hours later, the response came. In distant command centers, orders were drawn, rewritten, then issued in desperation. What had once been considered expendable was now declared vital. What had once been unreachable became the primary objective. That single strip of metal was judged to be more dangerous than an entire fleet. And so a counterstroke was planned. Artillery units at maximum range were angled and recalibrated. Remaining aircraft were gathered for a concentrated attack. Even small units were pushed into positions where they might strike at the perimeter under cover of darkness. The objective was clear: erase the runway. Because as long as that strip remained intact, the island did not belong to Japan, no matter how many men still stood upon it. That night, the sky changed tone. Instead of distant stars, it burned with muzzle flashes in the clouds. Shells howled overhead, tearing through darkness. The ground shook as impacts blossomed around the airstrip. Fire erupted at the edges of the field where supply crates had been stacked. For the first time since completion, the runway itself was under sustained attack. But it did not break. Steel against fire. Shells tore through metal. Sections lifted and collapsed. Craters formed along the surface. Smoke choked the field. Shrapnel rained against sandbags and armor plating. Yet from within the chaos, figures moved, low, fast, determined. Seabees and Marines ran straight toward the damage, not away from it. Under continuous fire, they dragged new sheets of steel matting into place. Other men shoveled debris from craters. Trucks reversed through smoke, headlights covered, engines roaring. Hammer blows and shouted signals cut through the thunder of artillery. The enemy had intended to wipe the airfield off the map. Instead, they were witnessing something that bordered on the impossible. Even as shells fell, the runway began to reappear, like a wound refusing to stay open. The moment of realization. Across hidden observation points, Japanese soldiers saw it. Through binoculars and burned glass, through drifting smoke and fire, they saw American silhouettes walking calmly along the strip they had just tried to destroy, lifting metal panels, setting them down, locking them into place. No panic, no hesitation, only continuation. That was the moment the meaning became unavoidable. They were not merely fighting soldiers. They were fighting an entire system, one that absorbed punishment, corrected itself, and resumed function as if destruction were nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. One Japanese officer later wrote in his report that it was like watching men attempting to drown the tide. The island could no longer be won. It could only be endured. The first land-based American advantage. When the shelling stopped, the runway was still there, scarred but functional. And within hours, American aircraft lifted from it again. That was the true turning point. Not the explosion, not the counterattack, not even the bombardment. It was the simple, unstoppable return to function. For the first time in that region of the Pacific, the United States no longer relied on carriers alone. It had planted a permanent spear into enemy space, a base that could not be sunk, drifted off course, or forced to retreat. The war had shifted from sea to land and sky combined. A new era had begun. From this moment, American reach expanded daily. Targets once marked unreachable were now circled in red. Operational planning changed entirely. New offensives were scheduled, calculated from the range of that single airstrip. And Japanese leadership understood something that would never leave them. Even if they held an island with every man they had left, if the Americans reached its shores for even one night, it could become an American airfield by morning. Silence after the storm. As the following dawn crept over the horizon, a strange quiet settled across the area. The guns were still, the planes rested, and the men who had fought the night stood looking out over the transformed landscape. Where devastation had been expected, there was function. Where defeat had been predicted, there was resilience. Where nature had once ruled, now there was purpose. The runway lay stretched before them, no longer just steel, but a symbol of what American industry, coordination, and what could achieve in a world tearing itself apart. In the distance, beyond ruined forests and wounded coastlines, the enemy prepared for whatever came next. But they all understood the truth now. The initiative had changed hands forever. And with that realization settled in, the story began shifting toward its consequences, the far-reaching aftermath that rippled through command rooms, supply lines, and battlefield psychology far beyond this small island. The world would feel the change. And that leads us to what happened next. By early 1944, the Pacific Theater had become a brutal chessboard spread across thousands of miles of ocean. Every island, no matter how small or remote, had the potential to tip the balance of power between the United States and Imperial Japan. What had once been obscure specks of land on a map were suddenly transformed into strategic linchpins, forward operating bases, refueling stations, radar outposts, and airfields that could determine the outcome of entire campaigns. The United States had adopted a strategy known as island hopping, a carefully calculated plan to bypass heavily fortified Japanese positions and instead capture key islands that could support airstrips and naval bases. From these newly secured islands, American forces could launch air raids, disrupt supply lines, and slowly tighten the noose around Japan itself. Each captured island became a stepping stone, bringing U.S. forces closer to the Japanese mainland. Japan, however, was not blind to this strategy. After suffering devastating losses at Midway in 1942 and Guadalcanal in 1943, Japanese military commanders grew increasingly desperate to fortify their remaining territories. They transformed islands into fortress-like strongholds, filled with bunkers, caves, heavy artillery positions, and camouflaged machine gun nests. Japanese soldiers were instructed that surrender was unacceptable. Defense was not simply a tactic, it was a matter of national and personal honor. As a result, battles in the Pacific became some of the most brutal and unforgiving fights in military history. Jungles swallowed soldiers alive. Coral reefs shredded landing craft. Tropical diseases killed almost as effectively as bullets. Sweltering heat, relentless humidity, and constant aerial bombardments turned every beachhead into a living nightmare. Yet, despite these terrifying conditions, both sides understood that air power was the true key to dominance in the Pacific. That's why airfields mattered more than almost anything else. Without an airfield, an island was simply land. With an airfield, it became a launch pad for destruction, a platform for which hundreds of bombers and fighter aircraft could control the skies for hundreds of miles in all directions. Aircraft could escort naval fleets, intercept enemy bombers, and strike military bases. An airfield could determine whether reinforcements arrived or whether they were annihilated before ever touching shore. Traditionally, constructing an airfield took weeks or even months. It required clearing dense vegetation, leveling terrain, laying compacted soil or metal matting, constructing fuel depots, building control towers, and establishing defensive positions. Under normal circumstances, such a massive engineering project demanded thousands of workers, heavy equipment, and time, something rarely available during the chaos of war. Yet the U.S. Marines came prepared with something revolutionary. Alongside infantry and artillery units came naval construction battalions, better known as the Seabees, highly trained engineers and construction workers who were also combat-ready soldiers. Their motto was simple but powerful: "We build, we fight." These men could clear jungle, repair runways under fire, construct bridges, and operate heavy machinery with terrifying efficiency. The Marines and Seabees practiced building temporary airstrips almost as quickly as they could capture a beachhead. They used a special invention called Marston matting, or PSP, pier steel planking, interlocking metal sheets that could be rolled out over uneven terrain to form a functional runway in a fraction of the time required for traditional construction. What once took months could now be done in days, sometimes even hours. And on one particular Pacific atoll, they would take this concept further than ever imagined. As Japanese forces patrolled their lines, confident in their defensive positions and isolated from the mainland, they had no idea that just beyond the horizon, U.S. naval forces and Marine units were already moving. Ships loaded with bulldozers, cranes, supplies, and prefabricated materials cut silently through the night. Orders were clear: secure the beach, level the land, and construct an operational airfield with unprecedented speed. This would not be just another military landing. It was an experiment in logistics and precision, a daring display of industrial power combined with tactical brilliance. The Japanese expected a slow, bloody invasion. What they witnessed instead would leave them stunned. In less than a single day, the Americans would accomplish something that previous generations would have believed impossible: the birth of a fully functional airstrip, seemingly conjured out of jungle and sand. And when that first American aircraft touched down, the psychological impact would be as powerful as any bomb ever dropped. This moment didn't just change the battle for one island. It changed the tempo of the entire Pacific War. The dawn arrived slowly, a pale yellow bleeding across the horizon. The waves lapped gently against the black volcanic sands of the beach, masking the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. Landing craft cut through the surf, their steel hulls scraping against coral as engines growled. Men braced themselves, equipment clutched tight, every movement measured. The Marines did not charge forward in a frenzy. They moved with purpose, precision honed through months of training. Their first task: secure the beach. Rifle fire echoed across the sand as small units advanced, taking cover behind rocks and driftwood. Machine guns barked from hidden Japanese bunkers. Shrapnel hissed through the air. The beach was alive with danger. Behind them, another wave approached: the Seabees, the builders, the engineers. Their weapons were tools, their combat readiness secondary to the machinery and materials they carried. Bulldozers, graders, prefabricated steel mats, and fuel drums were unloaded, each item assigned a precise role. Every crate, every panel, every bolt had been planned for months in advance. The ground itself was the enemy. Jagged coral and thick roots tore at boots and equipment. Trees and brush blocked the way, their massive roots entwined with the earth, resisting every attempt at removal. Sweat streamed down faces, muscles burned. Yet the work never paused. Bulldozers roared, axes bit into wood, chainsaws shrieked. Every cleared yard brought them closer to an operational airfield. By mid-morning, the first clearing began to take shape. Surveyors moved through the dust, marking precise lines with stakes and string. Bulldozers leveled the soil, flattening mounds of coral, filling depressions. Teams worked in coordination as if guided by a single mind. Ground that had been chaos just hours earlier was transforming into purpose. The Americans understood that any delay could cost them the element of surprise, and perhaps lives. Around the edges, Japanese artillery occasionally found purchase, sending shells screaming into the clearing. Smoke and debris mingled with the dust. A bulldozer tipped under the force of a near strike. Panels of metal were bent and mangled. But the work continued, almost impervious to destruction. Men lifted new mats into place, aligning them perfectly, locking edges together like pieces of a steel puzzle. Hammer blows rang out, echoing across the island, punctuating the roar of engines and the hiss of chainsaws. By early afternoon, the first stretch of runway had been laid. Long panels of pierced steel matting gleamed under the sun. Supply depots, temporary fuel tanks, and communication posts began taking shape along the edges. Radios were powered, antennas raised, signal lights installed. Every component, every tool, every man was synchronized, a mechanical symphony in the chaos of war. The first test came quietly. A small reconnaissance plane was rolled forward, engines igniting with a sputter and roar. Mechanics checked fuel lines, tightened bolts, and signaled readiness. The aircraft taxied slowly along the freshly laid steel. Wheels clattered against panels, sparks flying where metal met uneven coral below. And then it lifted, airborne for the first time from ground that had only existed that morning. A cheer rose from men lying in dust and sweat, a quiet acknowledgement of a feat that seemed almost impossible. Even as the first aircraft returned, the work did not stop. Crews moved along the runway, extending it further, replacing damaged panels, adding more fuel lines, constructing makeshift hangars from wooden frames and tarpaulin. Night fell, but the lights stayed on. Mechanics and engineers worked under floodlights, their shadows long and purposeful. Sleep was brief and optional. Every hour mattered. The island itself had become a machine, and every man a cog in its operation. Japanese observers in distant bunkers could not comprehend the speed and efficiency. Months of defensive preparation and expectation of delay meant nothing against a force that could claim, clear, and construct in a single day. Panic flickered across their faces. Every attempt at counterattack, artillery strikes, sniper fire, or air harassment, was anticipated and repaired before dawn. To them, it was as if the Americans were unstoppable, their resolve concrete, and their machinery eternal. By the second day, the runway extended nearly 1,000 feet. Aircraft moved from temporary assembly areas onto the steel, landing, refueling, taking off again within hours. Bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance planes rotated with precision. Supplies and ammunition were organized in pre-assigned sectors. Cranes moving pallets with mechanical exactness. Communication lines relayed information instantly. The island was no longer merely captured. It was transformed, an operational base capable of projecting American power hundreds of miles across the Pacific. And yet, amidst the roaring engines, pounding hammers, and distant artillery, the human element remained central. Marines and Seabees endured exhaustion, heat, and rain. They shared water, encouraged one another, and coordinated movements with hand signals and shouted commands. The sweat, blood, and effort of these men became as critical as steel and concrete. Without them, the matting and machinery were meaningless. Their courage was quiet but absolute, the backbone of a technological and logistical miracle. By nightfall on the second day, the first squadron of combat-ready aircraft was fully operational. Japanese artillery positions had been mapped, targeted, and neutralized. Supply lines once hidden were now vulnerable. The island had become a strategic node, capable of launching offensive and defensive operations simultaneously. For the Americans, it was a triumph of planning, skill, and endurance. For the Japanese, it was a revelation. The very rules of warfare on these islands had changed. From that moment, the island was no longer a passive territory. It had become a launch pad, a symbol of American ingenuity and military superiority, and a permanent thorn in the Japanese defensive network. Every subsequent battle, every sortie, every logistical maneuver would rely on the success of these first 2 days. And with the airfield operational, the stage was set for the decisive turning point, when the Americans leveraged this base not just to hold the island, but to dominate the surrounding region and redefine the war in the Pacific. The airfield did not remain quiet for long. Even before the first night passed, aircraft began moving along its gleaming steel panels. Fighters, dive bombers, and reconnaissance planes. Engines roared, wings sliced the humid air, and the first American sorties took off, signaling the start of a new chapter in the Pacific War. These missions were not chaotic. Each flight had a precise objective. Reconnaissance planes charted Japanese positions, mapping supply routes and artillery placements with unprecedented clarity. Dive bombers tested enemy defenses, striking lightly at key points while assessing reaction times. Fighters patrolled the surrounding sky, establishing dominance and ensuring the enemy could not threaten the newly constructed base. The impact was immediate. Japanese supply convoys, once considered secure, were intercepted in record time. Hidden artillery positions and troop movements were detected from above, and subsequent strikes crippled communication hubs, transportation routes, and staging areas. What had taken weeks or months to expose through traditional scouting was now revealed in hours, dramatically shortening the time it took for American forces to prepare their offensives. Precision bombing and tactical superiority. The first combat sorties demonstrated more than speed. They revealed a new level of precision in American air power. Bombing missions were planned meticulously. Bombs were not dropped indiscriminately. They were placed on target. Bridges collapsed exactly where engineers had predicted, fuel dumps erupted in firestorms, and command posts were neutralized with minimal wasted effort. Japanese troops on nearby islands could do nothing but watch. Their defensive lines, once formidable, were now vulnerable to attacks from the air at distances previously thought unreachable. For the first time, the combination of engineering ingenuity and tactical planning allowed the United States to project overwhelming force from a single, land-based location, a feat that Japanese forces had not anticipated. For American soldiers and engineers, the success of these missions validated their efforts. The airfield was no longer merely a construction project. It was a weapon in itself, a platform capable of controlling the skies, striking strategic targets, and redefining the balance of power in the region. Psychological effect on Japanese forces. Perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. Japanese commanders could not comprehend the rapid transformation of the island. Where they expected months of vulnerability, they saw instantaneous capability. Where they anticipated a prolonged buildup, they witnessed efficiency, precision, and relentless progress. Reports from Japanese observers described disbelief and growing fear. Every countermeasure they attempted, artillery fire, airstrikes, even limited ground assaults, failed to disrupt the functioning of the airfield. For the first time, they realized they were facing an enemy whose operational tempo exceeded their ability to respond. This psychological shock was compounded by the visibility of American operations. Reconnaissance flights over Japanese positions revealed the efficiency and scale of the airfield's activity. Soldiers noted the continuous cycle of aircraft taking off, landing, refueling, and relaunching. This demonstration of organizational mastery convinced Japanese units that the island was no longer just a point on the map. It was a pivot of American strategic power. Expansion and operational reach. With the initial successes, American forces expanded the airfield rapidly. Temporary hangars, fuel storage facilities, ammunition depots, and communication lines were all extended. Engineers worked around the clock to increase runway length, allowing larger bombers to operate. Each extension increased the range of American air operations, enabling strikes deeper into enemy-held territories. From this single base, reconnaissance aircraft could reach multiple nearby islands, reporting troop movements, naval activity, and infrastructure. Fighters provided air cover, ensuring that Japanese counterattacks could not interfere with ongoing construction or supply operations. Bombers delivered precision strikes against supply caches, artillery, and airfields, progressively degrading Japanese defensive capabilities. The speed and efficiency of these operations left Japanese units reacting constantly, never initiating action. Every offensive plan they attempted was anticipated and countered. They were not defeated immediately, but the strategic initiative, the ability to dictate where and when combat occurred, had shifted irrevocably to the Americans. Coordination between ground, air, and sea. The airfield became the centerpiece of an integrated operational network. Naval forces provided protection from sea-based threats, while Marines on the ground defended the perimeter. Aircraft launched from the Strip could engage targets far inland or over the ocean, creating a continuous operational cycle that expanded American control over both land and sea. Supply chains were optimized, allowing for rapid resupply of ammunition, fuel, and spare parts. Coordination between engineers, pilots, infantry, and logistics units transformed the airfield into a force multiplier, exponentially increasing the effectiveness of American operations in the Pacific. This level of coordination was unprecedented. Japanese forces had expected isolated attacks, limited strikes, or predictable patterns. Instead, they encountered a system capable of continuous, sustained operations, a mechanism that allowed Americans to respond instantly to changing conditions and threats. A step toward air superiority. The airfield's operational success quickly contributed to American air superiority in the region. Japanese aircraft attempting to approach the island were intercepted and neutralized before they could pose a significant threat. The airfield's existence forced the enemy to reconsider their defensive strategies, often pulling resources away from other areas to counter a threat that appeared virtually everywhere at once. By controlling the skies, American forces not only defended the island, but also prepared the region for future offensive operations. Nearby islands, previously considered safe by Japanese planners, were now within reach of fighter escorts and bomber attacks. The strategic landscape had shifted fundamentally. The Pacific was no longer a series of disconnected strongholds. The network of airfields created by the United States allowed coordinated, rapid strikes across the entire theater. Human stories amid the operations. Amid the precision strikes and logistical achievements, human stories emerged. Marines stood watch on the edges of the runway, exhausted but alert, ensuring Japanese forces could not infiltrate. Seabees repaired damage in near-constant rotation, often under enemy fire. Pilots pushed their aircraft to limits, landing and taking off from a strip that had been jungle mere days before. These men were witnesses to the immediate effects of their labor. Every sortie that returned safely, every mission completed with precision, reinforced the understanding that their work, building a runway under impossible conditions, had directly altered the course of the campaign. The island had become more than a staging area. It had become a symbol of American ingenuity, resolve, and superiority, both technological and human. The bigger picture. Ultimately, the impact of this airfield extended far beyond the immediate island. It served as a proof of concept for subsequent operations across the Pacific. The lessons learned: rapid construction, coordination of air, sea, and land forces, and the psychological effect on enemy forces, informed every following campaign. American forces no longer merely invaded islands. They transformed them overnight into offensive platforms, accelerating the pace of the war and ensuring strategic dominance. The Japanese forces, watching from afar, understood the shift with growing dread. American ingenuity, speed, and coordination could strike anywhere, anytime. Every previously safe location was now a potential launch point for devastation. The construction of a single airfield had changed the tactical, operational, and psychological balance across the Pacific. And with these lessons in mind, American commanders began planning the next phase of operations, the decisive moments that would define the turning point in this theater of war. The transformation of the island was not subtle. By the third day after the landing, the airfield had become a heartbeat, pulsing relentlessly across the once-forgotten atoll. Each plane that rolled down the runway or lifted into the humid air carried more than bombs or reconnaissance gear. It carried American authority and intent. The enemy could no longer ignore what was happening. Japanese commanders, perched in hardened bunkers across neighboring islands, began to piece together the scale of the achievement. Reports flooded in, aircraft taking off in rapid succession, supply crates moving with meticulous order, artillery targets being neutralized with precision strikes. The impossibility of it struck them first. How could a fully operational airfield exist in a place captured only days before? Their disbelief quickly turned to fear. The first offensive from the new airfield. In the early hours before dawn, a carefully selected strike package readied itself. This was no routine sortie. It was a coordinated offensive intended to demonstrate American reach and dominance in a single operation. Pilots received their briefings quickly. Maps were laid out in the faint light of field lamps. Key Japanese positions highlighted. Supply depots, artillery emplacements, communication hubs. Bombers were fueled, fighters prepped, and reconnaissance planes positioned to relay real-time intelligence. Every element had a role, every movement timed precisely. Engines ignited with a low, steady roar. The vibrations traveled through the steel matting underfoot, shaking the dust from the air. Marines and Seabees stepped back, watching the first aircraft taxi toward the edge of the runway. Then the second, the third. Within minutes, a continuous line of American planes rose into the sky, the horizon filled with black silhouettes against the pale dawn. The Japanese forces watched in stunned silence. No one had anticipated this speed. No one had imagined the coordination. No one had believed an enemy could launch such an offensive so rapidly from newly captured territory. The impact of a strike. Within minutes, bombs fell with surgical precision. Bridges collapsed into rivers. Supply depots erupted in fire, and artillery positions that had seemed untouchable were reduced to rubble. Japanese soldiers scrambled, attempting to man defensive positions, but American air power was everywhere. Fighters intercepted any approaching aircraft. Bombers returned safely, ready to strike again. The scale of destruction was remarkable. It was not chaotic. Every strike had a purpose. Every mission was designed to cripple, disorient, and dominate, not to merely terrorize. And the airfield, the central hub of this operation, proved its worth beyond measure. Japanese intelligence officers recorded the events in disbelief. What had required months in traditional warfare, the Americans had achieved in days. The airfield was no longer a construction project. It was a weapon of war itself. The enemy's desperate counterattacks. By midday, Japanese artillery finally concentrated on the airfield. Shells screamed through the humid air, striking the steel matting with explosive force. Craters opened in the freshly laid runway. Smoke and debris choked the air. From observation points, Japanese officers anticipated that this would disrupt American operations. But they underestimated one crucial factor. The Seabees and Marines were ready. Teams rushed to repair damage under fire. Steel panels were lifted, realigned, and secured. Craters were filled. Fuel lines were repaired. Within an hour, the runway was operational again. For the Japanese soldiers witnessing this, the psychological shock was as significant as the physical destruction. Every attempt to destroy the airfield was met with immediate restoration. What should have been a victory turned into evidence of American resilience and efficiency. Reports later noted their disbelief. We watched them repair what we had just destroyed, as if the island itself refused to yield. Psychological turning point. The realization spread rapidly among Japanese troops. American forces were not just strong, they were unstoppable in their ability to adapt, rebuild, and project power. Their initiative had shifted irreversibly. The defensive strategies that once relied on terrain and preparation were now ineffective. From this day forward, every Japanese calculation included a new variable: the presence of a permanent American airfield capable of supporting rapid, sustained operations. Morale faltered in small units. Commanders questioned whether any location could truly be defended. The psychological weight of facing an enemy that could strike from nowhere and restore its strength immediately began to outweigh any numerical advantage. The Pacific Theater, once a vast expanse offering the illusion of safety, shrank under the shadow of this steel strip, preparing for the next phase. Even as Japanese forces scrambled, American commanders used the airfield to expand operations. Reconnaissance flights mapped surrounding islands. Bombers struck lightly defended positions. Fighters patrolled the skies, establishing control over airspace that had been contested for years. The turning point was not simply the airfield's construction. It was the operational dominance it enabled. For the first time, U.S. forces could dictate the tempo of battle. Every offensive, every strike, and every landing was now orchestrated from this single hub. The initiative had shifted irreversibly. And for the men on the ground, the lesson was clear. The island was no longer a contested outpost. It was American territory in function, if not yet in name, and it was a platform from which the rest of the Pacific would be challenged. The sun had fully risen, casting long shadows across the steel matting of the airfield. Smoke from earlier shelling drifted lazily, yet the runway remained intact, functional, and ready. Every aircraft that had launched earlier returned with precision, some scarred by combat, others unscathed, but all ready to fly again. The Americans had turned the impossible into reality. Japanese forces, hidden behind cliffs and in hardened bunkers, could hardly comprehend what they were witnessing. Their artillery, carefully aimed, had failed to halt the American advance. Their reconnaissance reports, once confident, now described a relentless, unstoppable cycle. Planes launching, striking, returning, and rearming within hours. The very idea of denying the Americans' air superiority seemed absurd. Commanders convened hurriedly, their discussions laced with disbelief. How could a single captured island sustain such operations? How could a base appear fully functional in mere days, even under bombardment? Every assumption about operational timelines had been shattered. For the Japanese soldiers observing the spectacle, shock turned to desperation. Defensive positions became targets almost immediately. Every attempt to respond was anticipated and countered. They could not adapt quickly enough. For the first time in this sector of the Pacific, Japanese forces were reacting instead of controlling. The enemy's realization. As artillery strikes and sporadic air attacks continued, one truth became undeniable. The airfield was not merely a tactical achievement. It was a demonstration of American industrial and military superiority. The combination of Marines, Seabees, and coordinated air power had created a platform from which the Pacific Theater could be reshaped. Reports from Japanese officers noted their astonishment. Soldiers stared in disbelief, noting that every attempt to destroy or disrupt operations failed. Ammunition dumps, fuel depots, and communication hubs were quickly repaired or relocated. Craters in the steel matting were filled before enemy observers could even confirm the damage. One officer described the scene. It was as if the Americans were immune to fire. Every action we took was answered with an immediate restoration of strength. We could not comprehend their efficiency. It was as though we were witnessing the impossible. The psychological impact of this realization was profound. Units that had once fought with pride began to hesitate. Morale faltered. Commanders second-guessed plans. Soldiers feared the very air above them, where American dominance was constant and relentless. American initiative secures control. By mid-afternoon, the airfield was fully operational again, despite hours of continuous enemy shelling. Pilots launched their next missions, bombing supply lines, strafing troop movements, and intercepting any Japanese aircraft that dared approach. The airfield had shifted the balance of power. For the Americans, this was not merely a defensive success. It was the first true turning point in the campaign for this region. With a secure airfield, they could control the skies, coordinate naval movements, and project force into previously unreachable territories. Japanese assumptions about terrain and isolation were shattered. The island itself had become a pivot point. Every sortie demonstrated that initiative was no longer a shared advantage. It belonged to the Americans. Into the turning point. As evening approached, the island fell into a tense calm. The roar of engines faded, leaving only the occasional hum of machinery and the distant crackle of gunfire. Marines and Seabees moved along the runway, inspecting and repairing where necessary, ensuring the airfield would remain functional through the night. From distant observation posts, Japanese forces were left to absorb the reality. The Americans had achieved strategic, operational, and psychological superiority in a single, concentrated effort. Their hopes of holding the island or denying its use had been shattered. The climax of this operation was not measured in the number of bombs dropped or the hours of work endured. It was measured in control, initiative, and inevitability. The Americans had demonstrated a new kind of warfare, one that combined speed, precision, engineering, and relentless execution. This turning point did not just affect the battle at hand. It set a precedent for the Pacific campaigns that followed. Islands could be captured and transformed almost overnight. Supply lines and defenses that had been considered secure were now vulnerable to coordinated, sustained American operations. And as night fell over the island, the men who had built and defended the runway understood a quiet truth. This was not just an airfield. It was a declaration that from this point forward, the Americans controlled the tempo of war in the Pacific. The first light of dawn revealed the true impact of the previous days. Smoke still drifted over the island, curling in the early sunlight. The airfield, scarred by bombardment yet fully operational, stood as a testament to American ingenuity, resilience, and sheer determination. For the men who had fought, built, and defended it, there was no time to rest, but a quiet satisfaction lingered. Their work had reshaped the battlefield and altered the course of the campaign. Across the Pacific, Japanese commanders struggled to assess the situation. Reports flowed in from reconnaissance units and surviving artillery observers. Supply depots were destroyed. Communication lines were disrupted. Morale among frontline troops had begun to fracture. Even the most experienced officers admitted that they had underestimated American capacity for rapid construction, operational planning, and tactical coordination. One report, later captured in Allied intelligence, described Japanese disbelief. The Americans have taken what should have been an island of death and made it a platform of power. Every measure we take is countered before it can take effect. We are forced to react, not act. This reactive posture marked a fundamental shift in initiative. Before, Japanese forces had been able to choose when and where battles occurred. Now, the Americans dictated the tempo, selecting targets, timing strikes, and controlling access to air and sea lanes. Casualties and physical damage. While the operational success was clear, the human and material costs were real. Artillery strikes had damaged portions of the airfield and nearby infrastructure. Supply and ammunition depots had burned. Casualties among construction crews were limited thanks to careful coordination and protective measures, but the intensity of enemy fire had left several Marines wounded. Despite these challenges, every setback was addressed with meticulous speed. Repair teams moved continuously, replacing damaged steel panels, rebuilding craters, and restoring communications. The airfield remained operational around the clock. By the end of the first week, even areas struck by concentrated artillery had been repaired, proving the Americans' logistical dominance. Operational consequences. The airfield's creation allowed a series of offensive operations that had been impossible just days before. Fighter patrols secured airspace for miles, reducing the threat from Japanese aircraft. Bombing sorties disrupted supply chains across multiple islands, delaying reinforcements and weakening defensive positions. Intelligence collected from reconnaissance flights informed future invasions, allowing American forces to plan with unprecedented precision. Perhaps most importantly, the airfield shifted the operational balance. Islands that had been considered safe for Japanese forces were now within immediate reach of American air power. Artillery emplacements, previously secure due to isolation, were vulnerable to coordinated strikes. This network effect, projecting power from one fortified, functional island to multiple surrounding territories, marked a turning point in the Pacific strategy. Psychological impact on Japanese forces. Beyond physical destruction, the psychological effects were profound. Japanese soldiers and commanders alike reported feelings of disbelief and intimidation. The speed of construction, the seamless integration of air, sea, and ground operations, and the Americans' ability to repair and continue functioning under fire shattered expectations of warfare. Morale among Japanese troops began to decline. Even well-trained and well-equipped units felt the weight of operating under constant threat. Decision-making slowed, hesitation increased, and the initiative, previously theirs, was irreversibly lost. One Japanese officer later reflected in a war diary, "We had prepared for months to resist. Yet the Americans did not merely attack. They built, repaired, and struck again with relentless certainty. It was as if the island itself had sided with them." American perspective and morale. For American forces, the aftermath reinforced confidence and cohesion. The Marines and Seabees recognized the significance of their achievement. A small, coordinated team could alter the operational landscape of the entire Pacific theater. Success was tangible. Planes took off and returned, supply lines flowed, and reconnaissance confirmed enemy vulnerabilities. The human element, the courage, endurance, and coordination of the men on the ground, had proven decisive. The airfield was more than steel and machinery. It was a demonstration of what disciplined, organized, and skilled personnel could accomplish in extreme conditions. Strategic lessons learned. Commanders at higher levels took note immediately. The success of rapid airfield construction under fire provided a blueprint for future operations. Islands could be seized and converted into forward bases faster than previously thought possible. This accelerated the pace of the Pacific campaign, allowing American forces to bring air power to bear across multiple islands simultaneously. The lesson was clear: control of the skies, combined with operational flexibility and logistical superiority, was now the defining factor in the Pacific theater. Japanese forces would increasingly find themselves reacting to American initiatives, marking a psychological and strategic shift that would influence every subsequent engagement. The island, now fully operational as a base, had shifted the balance of power. What had begun as a tactical landing had become a strategic turning point, reshaping not only the battlefield but the entire course of operations in the region. In the days following the establishment of the airfield, the full ripple effect of American success became evident. From this single island, the United States now wielded operational control over a vast swath of the surrounding ocean and neighboring territories. Supply routes that had once been secure for Japanese forces were now disrupted with surgical precision. Convoys were intercepted, ammunition depots destroyed, and troop movements anticipated before they could be executed. The Japanese response was consistent but ineffective. Artillery barges continued, aircraft were scrambled in attempts to strike the airfield, and limited ground assaults were launched on surrounding outposts. Each effort was met with immediate repair, counteraction, or interception. The combination of air, ground, and logistical superiority rendered these attacks futile. In practical terms, the Americans had established control without contest, while the Japanese were left in a reactive posture. Psychological and strategic consequences. The psychological impact on Japanese forces cannot be overstated. Commanders had anticipated a drawn-out struggle, a protracted siege that would test American endurance. Instead, they witnessed a display of precision, efficiency, and relentless initiative that defied their expectations. Observers described scenes of stunned disbelief, soldiers frozen at the edge of bunkers, and officers questioning whether any position could be defended effectively. This erosion of confidence had immediate operational consequences. Hesitation slowed decision-making, units became overly cautious, and the initiative, previously Japanese, now rested firmly with American commanders. Strategic calculations had to be revised. Territories once considered safe for staging reinforcements were now vulnerable, and defensive plans could no longer assume control of air or sea domains. Operational expansion. American forces capitalized on the airfield's capabilities almost immediately. New sorties reached previously inaccessible islands, providing reconnaissance, delivering precision strikes, and escorting supply vessels with unprecedented security. Fighter patrols ensured continuous air dominance, allowing for flexible, multi-pronged operations that could be executed simultaneously across the region. The operational tempo shifted dramatically. Where once attacks were planned for weeks, now they could be executed within days. Each successful mission reinforced the perception of American inevitability. Japanese forces faced a growing logistical and tactical disadvantage, as their ability to control or even predict engagements eroded with each passing operation. Integration of air, sea, and land. The airfield was not an isolated success. It was the centerpiece of a fully integrated operational network. Marines on the ground maintained defensive positions and coordinated with artillery units, while Seabees ensured continuous repair and expansion of facilities. Naval forces provided protection and logistical support. Aircraft launched from the airfield could reach targets hundreds of miles away, and intelligence gathered from each sortie informed the next. This integration allowed American forces to project sustained power across multiple domains, effectively controlling not just one island, but the surrounding theater. Japanese forces, confined to a reactive strategy, could not counter this level of coordination. Each failed response further undermined morale and reinforced the perception of American dominance. Human stories of endurance and skill. Amid these strategic and operational consequences, the human element remained central. Marines endured continuous rotations of guard duty, often under punishing heat and heavy humidity. Seabees repaired and extended the runway, sometimes working alongside wounded comrades, demonstrating extraordinary resilience. Pilots returned from sorties with minor or severe damage to their aircraft, yet they prepared for subsequent missions with the same focus and determination. These individual acts of courage and endurance were critical to sustaining the operational advantage. The human effort behind the airfield's success, the labor, risk, and ingenuity of every man involved, transformed a tactical victory into a strategic turning point. Long-term strategic shifts. By the end of the first week, the implications of the airfield's rapid construction and operationalization were clear. Japanese command had to rethink its entire defensive posture across the Pacific. Islands once considered secure became vulnerable. Strategic supply lines were now under constant threat. The Japanese military's ability to plan offensively was curtailed, while the Americans could dictate the pace, location, and intensity of operations. For American commanders, this success became a blueprint. Future campaigns adopted the same principles: rapid construction, coordinated air-ground naval operations, and psychological dominance over the enemy. The airfield was not just a tactical victory. It was a model for modern amphibious warfare, influencing operations for months to come. Setting the stage for reflection. The island, scarred but operational, symbolized more than a single campaign. It was the culmination of planning, skill, and relentless execution. It proved that American forces could combine technology, engineering, and human endurance to achieve results previously deemed impossible. This success would not only influence the immediate campaign, but also redefined perceptions of warfare, power projection, and the operational tempo required to dominate the Pacific. It created a psychological and strategic precedent that reshaped enemy calculations and reinforced American confidence in the months ahead. As the sun set over the now functional airfield, the island stood transformed. Once a distant, seemingly inconsequential outpost, it had become the epicenter of American power projection in the Pacific, a harbinger of victories to come and a testament to the skill, resilience, and ingenuity of every man who had touched its soil. The story of this airfield and the men who built it would resonate far beyond the Pacific, offering a blueprint for modern warfare and an enduring example of how preparation, coordination, and determination could alter the course of history. The island now rests in the quiet of the Pacific, but its story resonates far beyond its shores. What was once dense jungle, coral, and sand became a symbol of American ingenuity, endurance, and operational mastery. The rapid construction of the airfield demonstrated that victory in modern warfare was not solely a matter of numbers or firepower. It was a combination of speed, coordination, and the disciplined application of knowledge. The men who built, defended, and operated the airfield embodied the very essence of this principle. Marines and Seabees worked as one, merging the line between combatant and engineer, creating a force capable of transforming terrain into strategic advantage within hours. Pilots turned that advantage into tangible results, projecting American power across hundreds of miles, striking where the enemy least expected, and maintaining an unbroken operational tempo. Each individual contribution, though small in isolation, combined into a force multiplier that redefined the rules of engagement. For Japanese forces, the experience was a harsh revelation. No longer could defensive fortifications, isolated positions, or calculated delays guarantee security. The Americans demonstrated an ability to act faster, repair faster, and strike with unprecedented precision. What Japanese commanders once considered immutable truths about warfare, terrain, time, and preparation, were now challenged by sheer ingenuity and relentless execution. Historically, this operation stands as a turning point in Pacific campaigns, illustrating how engineering, logistics, and air power could decisively influence outcomes. Strategically, it set a precedent for island hopping, rapid base construction, and the psychological impact of dominating the skies before the enemy could react. Tactically, it proved that meticulous preparation and coordinated effort could overcome natural obstacles and enemy defenses alike. Beyond the statistics and maps, this story is about human resilience and innovation under pressure. It reminds us that war is not just measured in explosions and casualties, but in the ability of men to create, adapt, and endure. The airfield, now a testament to those efforts, became more than a runway. It became a statement of intent, a projection of power, and a lesson in what determination and skill can achieve against impossible odds. And as the sun sets over the Pacific horizon, one truth remains clear. History is shaped not only by who fights, but by who can build, adapt, and act faster than anyone else. And in that moment, the Americans had proven both.